underscore that social memory studies, cognitive memory studies, are somewhat of a different beast. Although I was privileged to read some of the most recent work of Alan Kirk on the recent developments of cognitive memory in Germany and in the States, and that work too is increasingly looking more and more like Havelock's and Osman's type of work. It's emphasizing the culturally scripted nature in memory when it's first embedded, not just when it's articulated. But I'm not going to pursue that very far here. I just want to underscore that for these three scholars, Havelock, Osman, and Schwartz, for each of them, social memory theory is not primarily about discovering or recovering the actual past. For Havelock, that is actually the precise opposite of collective memory. Things are different for Osman and Schwartz, but not because they think social memory theory is about the actual past. Rather, they view history and memory as related instead of opposites. For Havelock's, history and memory are opposites. For Osman and Schwartz, they're different because they reject the historical positivism of Havelock's. For Osman and Schwartz, the theory primarily addresses continuities and discontinuities in the development of memory culture. One can put it to use for historiographical purposes, but that is not its primary focus. Or to say it another way, although the historian may decide to take the further steps of understanding or imagining the actual past, he or she cannot do so without taking the initial steps of understanding the commemorative practices by which it reached him or her. The theory itself, however, is most concerned with those practices, not the actual past. Number one, transmission of the oral gospel tradition and form criticism. Although not receiving the kind of attention that social memory theory has received in historical Jesus studies, by far the most matured area of application of social memory theory and gospels research concerns the transmission of the oral Jesus tradition. Many scholars have found social memory theory's descriptions of the dynamic relationships between the present and the past a useful framework for conceptualizing the transmission of the oral tradition. Rafael Rodriguez has written a full monograph on the topic, and Eric Eve has also employed the memory approach in his overview of the scholarly discussion, both of which are very excellent volumes. Since the formation and transmission of the oral Jesus tradition was the focus of form criticism, it is little surprise that many applications of social memory theory in this area have engaged form criticism and its lingering effects in gospel scholarship. Many of these assessments have been critical in light of its near total emphasis upon the Sitzenleben der Kirche, whether Hellenistic or Palestinian, but the emphasis upon the Sitzenleben der Kirche over the Sitzenleben Jesu. Gospel scholars, as well as social memory theorists outside of biblical studies, have identified form criticism as a thoroughly presentist perspective. Although he was merely repeating the earlier opinion of Bultmann, Paul Winter's assessment of the controversy narrative serves as a clear example of this presentist tendency. He says, quote, "All the Markan controversy stories, without exception, reflect disputes between the apostolic church and its social environment and are devoid of roots in the circumstances of the life of Jesus." End quote. From the continuity perspective of social memory theory, this failure to consider seriously the ways in which the past could have contributed to early Christians' presence is a severe oversight. In other words, even if Winter is true that they're imagining these things, it does not answer the question of why they are and why they're taking the shape that they are. In other words, why was there a controversy that produced these imaginations? Previous typologies provide categories for the present, and thus structure or restrain the interpretive freedom of the present to an extent as groups assimilate the novum to the known. In some instances, such as descriptive violence of a crucifixion, the past presses itself more forcibly upon the present, even while the present scrambles to find typological frames with which to master the shattering of group identity. The past does not always pressure the present in this manner, but examples such as this point to a much more complex interaction between the present and the past than form criticism's unidirectional theory of the transmission of the oral Jesus tradition can accommodate. Another area in which gospel scholars have been critical of form criticism is its treatment of the shift between the oral and the written tradition. Although this shift served as the crucial threshold between early Palestinian Christianity and later Hellenistic Christianity, Bultmann famously regarded the transition as, quote, nothing in principle new, but only a completion of what was begun in the oral tradition, end quote. In 1983, Kelber persuasively argued on the basis of the dynamics of oral tradition that the textualization of Mark's gospel was not a logical, evolutionary, or organic process, as Bultmann and others imagined. Rather, and as Graham Stanton had also earlier observed, somehow Stanton gets forgotten completely in this discussion, but as Graham Stanton had also earlier observed, it is a significant alteration to the Jesus tradition that requires explanation. Jan Osman's concept of cultural memory adds considerable weight to Kelber's and Stanton's contention. Here, the textualization of tradition is a reconstitution of identity marking efforts that occurs at the crossroads of communicative and cultural memory. It's thus an important step on the path toward canonization. In Kelber's later work, he has adopted Osman's cultural memory model, and so have Alan Kirk, Joanna Dewey, and I, each in our own ways. We don't all agree with each other, but we've all found this to be good. Applications of memory theory to early Christian media transitions have not focused singly on the Gospel of Mark, however. In his and Kirk's seminal 2005 Semea volume on social memory theory, Tom Thatcher addressed the Gospel of John's transition from oral to written tradition. Thatcher observes that the Johannine author's concept of spirit-enabled memory of Jesus that leads into all truth, John 14:26 and 16:13, runs against the common scholarly concept that a Christian moved Johannine gospel tradition to book form in order to meet an archival need. In other words, working with the logic of the Gospel of John, you don't need a book to remember. You only need the Spirit. So why did he get Mike to write a book? Thatcher therefore suggests that John's Gospel was textualized in order to draw upon the rhetorical value of text as material artifacts in order to seal a particular Christology. Finally, form criticism's division of the Gospel tradition into traditions that reflect the past, the Sitzenleben Jesu, or the present, the Sitzenleben der Kirche, stands in direct opposition to Hoblock's and others' insights concerning memory formation. If all memory is constructed from the perspective of the present, there is no tradition or memory that can be extricated from those present social frameworks. From this perspective, the concomitant form-critical notion that one could sift through the layers of the Jesus tradition in order to excavate earlier tradition from later ecclesiastical accretions is thoroughly misguided, and I'll return to this. By the way, I use square quotes, not coats, or scare quotes.
No square.
Scare quotes on tradition and memory, because as you'll soon figure out on this panel, tradition and memory mean each a million different things. Every person that's in this discussion has a different understanding of what those words mean. So, right. In light of these critical assessments of form criticism, one could easily get the impression that scholars employing the memory approach have been only critical of form criticism, and Dr. Foster intimates this in his recent article. I think this perspective is incorrect. Scholars have also used social memory theory in order to underscore form criticism's lasting contributions and build upon them. One obvious affirmation of form criticism by social memory theory is the pivotal role that form criticism assigned to the present, Sitzenleben, of the transmitters of the gospel tradition. Although they were wrong to neglect the past, they were entirely right to highlight the significance of the present. In addition, scholars have affirmed, augmented, or rehabilitated specific aspects of form criticism from a memory perspective. And here I'm thinking of the work of Samuel Bierskog has developed a concept of the Sitzenleben in light of social memory theory. Bierskog has also developed a perspective on Krya as mnemonic devices. In other words, these bits of tradition that transmitted together. And Ruben Zimmermann also has done a lot of work on parables as a mnemonic device. And all of these, along with some of the work of Alan Kirk, has emphasized that, as Kirk says, social memory theory in many ways takes over prominent aspects of form criticism and develops them. These appropriations of social memory theory stand generally in the line of Osman's cultural memory theory, which moved Havelock's original insights more intentionally into the ancient media culture. Furthermore, they demonstrate that New Testament scholars who have appropriated social memory theory have been neither oblivious to its similarities to form criticism nor solely negative to form criticism. Number two, the criteria of authenticity. The relationship between social memory theory and form criticism also stands at the crux of another important issue in gospel studies, the criteria of authenticity. The criteria of authenticity are no strangers to criticism, and this criticism reached an apex in this wonderful book from 2012. It's a damn fine volume, if I do say so myself. You can pick it up out there. They're no strangers to criticism, but scholars approaching them from the perspective of social memory theory have heightened that criticism by focusing particularly on the problematic assumption that lies at their very core, namely that scholars can separate authentic Jesus tradition from inauthentic Jesus tradition. As is clear in the writings of Kaisman and others, the criteria approach inherited directly from form criticism the assumption that scholars can separate the gospel tradition into two piles, one of which reflects the past of Jesus and the other of which reflects the present of the early Christians, crafting, fabricating, and transmitting the traditions. As I've already discussed, however, the base assertion of sociological approaches to memory, from Havelock's to the present day and across the spectrum of presentism and the continuity perspective, is that all memory is inextricably bound to the social frameworks of the present that enable the articulation and conceptualization of the past. If this is the case, then the assumption that scholars can separate and recover historical reality from the individual or group interpretation of that reality is problematic. Jeffrey Ulrich says, if experience is always embedded in and occurs through narrative frames, then there is no primal, unmediated experience that can be recovered. The distinction between history and memory in such accounts is a matter of disciplinary power rather than of epistemological privilege. Or, as Rafael Rodriguez notes, quote, memory does not preserve the past in a way that allows for the separation of historical fact and later interpretation. I really want to underscore here, though, that Rodriguez does not claim that historians are incapable of making informed decisions about historical fact and later interpretation. He asserts only that the tradition itself cannot be separated. Number three, the new historiography. This rather simple observation about the inseparable nature of past reality and present interpretation has toppled a very long-standing method in historical Jesus studies because it requires a redefinition of history and memory that does not hold these two concepts in opposition by defining the former as the past that historians recover from interpretations in the sources and defining the latter as interpretations in the sources from which the past must be recovered. This shift in memory theory dovetails with similar developments in theories of history and orality studies. Applications of these theories to the Gospels collectively represent a new historiography in historical Jesus studies that breaks sharply from the atomistic criteria approach and similar approaches that focus on isolated sayings or actions of Jesus. Jens Schroeder has consistently led these efforts to construct Neutestamentliche Wissenschaft Insights des Historismus. It is notable, I think, that Foster's and Crook's recent criticisms of social memory applications in gospel studies fail to engage his work. Already in 2011, Rudolf Zimmermann could rightly refer to Schroeder's studies as bahnbrechend and indicate that scholars have recognized it as such for some time already. In very general terms, Schroeder proposes that every approach to the historical Jesus behind the Gospels has to explain how these writings could have come into being as the earliest descriptions of this person. Insofar as this approach therefore grounds historical Jesus inquiry in the past as portrayed in our extant sources, it is similar to what Osman labeled memo history, which also foregrounds the texts and traditions that they stand before historians. Related directly to this fact, Schroeder has